Göbekli Tepe, the famous 12,000-year-old site in southeast Turkey, is the oldest megalithic temple complex in the world. There's actually a handful of other Tepe sites that are contemporary with Göbekli Tepe, like Karahan Tepe and others. And it seems like they're discovering new Tepe sites all the time. These T-pillars just stick out of the ground. But at Gobekli Tepe, it's been excavated to a beautiful point, and we can observe that these T-pillar temples consist primarily of two dominant T-pillars, which here you can see in a ruined state, but we'll take a look at some better preserved ones in a minute, surrounded by smaller T-pillars embedded in a smaller, non-megalithic matrix of not rubble, but much smaller stones. And one of the interesting things is the dominant T-pillars in these temples always face north-south. So you'd enter the temple from the south, facing north. The people of Gobekli Tepe, it's believed that they would always pray and worship at these temples facing north. Another interesting characteristic of the dominant T-pillars in the center of the temples is that they're somewhat anthropomorphized. They have arms, they have hands and fingers that seem to almost touch just below their navel. But we're not going to spend too much time on Gobekli Tepe today, because what's really fascinating to me is the temples that the Taliotic culture of Menorca was building thousands of years later on a tiny island in the Mediterranean that's almost identical to the temples that were built in Gobekli Tepe. So buckle up, because we're heading to Menorca. Going into this trip, I really didn't know anything about the Taula, the Taliots, the Taliotic culture that supposedly built these monuments, other than a few photos that I had seen on the internet. So this was an immersive trip just to really investigate what connections there could be between Gobekli Tepe, Karahan Tepe, and the temple building culture of Menorca. So here we are at Teralba Den Salor, and immediately I'm just blown away. I was expecting to find a T-pillar, and what I found was a T-pillar inside of a circular enclosure where the walls are made up of much smaller stones, not necessarily rubble, but a matrix of smaller stones with upright pillars embedded in the walls. Now look at this. This Taula has what appears to be a spine on the back of it. As you know, the T-pillars of Gobekli Tepe, many of them, but not all of them, were anthropomorphized. And the fact that this T-pillar has a spine, to me, is a clear anthropomorphic element, which is just incredible. At Gobekli Tepe, we find a lot of T-pillars that have arms and hands, and we don't find that in Menorca, but we do find this T-pillar that has a spine. The big question I immediately had was whether the surrounding upright megaliths were originally T-pillars as well, just like at Gobekli Tepe. You can see around all these Taula temples the megalithic pillars that are embedded in the wall. In Gobekli Tepe, these are all T-pillars as well. So I wanted to find out whether or not the Taula temples of Menorca also had T-pillars embedded in the wall, or were these just upright megaliths? Luckily, I didn't have to go much further than the Museo de Menorca to find this model of how the Taula temples originally looked, and you can see that indeed they were originally T-pillars embedded in the walls of these temples. Not only that, but I discovered that the Taula are oriented north-south, so that when you enter the temple to the south, you're facing north, and the back of the T-pillars faces to the north, and the front of the T-pillar faces to the south, just like at Gobekli Tepe. So far, the similarities are striking. In Menorca, you have a single dominant T-pillar facing north-south. In Gobekli Tepe, you have two dominant T-pillars facing north-south. In Gobekli Tepe, you have some of the T-pillars are anthropomorphized. In Menorca, there's at least one T-pillar that's anthropomorphized. In both sites, you have T-pillars embedded into walls consisting of smaller stones, and you have these circular enclosures. So what is going on here? Gobekli Tepe is a 12,000-year-old site dating to about 10,000 BCE, whereas the Taliotic culture of Menorca was active around 1800 BCE up to maybe about 400 BCE. So these cultures are separated not only by a vast distance, but by almost 10,000 years, if not more. But here in Menorca, you just find these T-pillar temples everywhere. And similar to in Turkey, how you just find T-pillars sticking out of the ground all over the place, it's been a similar story in Menorca. They find T-pillars still sticking out of the ground all over the place that have not yet been excavated. Here at Torre d'en Galm, you can see another example of this with lots of upright megaliths that all used to be T-pillars arranged in a circle, very reminiscent of the temples in Turkey. So the next question we have to ask ourselves is, who were the Taliotic people? And it turns out it's a bit of a mystery. Nobody really knows where they came from. They just showed up on the island of Menorca and started building these temples and these structures around 1800 BCE. There is a strong argument to be made that the Taliotic people came from the island of Sardinia, because the taliots that were built nearby these Taula temples seem to resemble the Nuragis of Sardinia. And here we are looking at a taliot. These are sort of towered structures. They don't really know what purpose they served. They seem to be lookout towers, but then they would place multiple taliots in close proximity to each other, which raises the question of why would you need multiple lookout towers? So they seem to serve multiple functions, but they're not really well understood, or even really understood at all. Nobody really knows what purpose they served, and nobody even really knows who these people were that arrived on the island and started building them. But again, if you look on the island of Sardinia, you find these Nuragis, and the people of Sardinia actually built almost 10,000 of these Nuragis, and they were active around the same time as the Taliotic people of Menorca. And while the Nuragic civilization of Sardinia did not build taulas or T-pillar temples, there are a number of intriguing connections between Sardinia and Turkey / Gobekli Tepe that we are going to delve into in the next video. But we're not quite done with Menorca yet, and there's a lot more here that I want to show you and tell you about. Here we are at the site of Son Katlar, and what's fascinating about this site is you basically have this wall. It's absolutely massive, and it's a cyclopean megalithic wall, at least on its bottom course of masonry. And on the upper course of masonry, you have a much smaller, much less sophisticated, much rougher layer of masonry, which seems to suggest two phases of construction, similar to what you see in Peru and South America, where you have the most incredible stonework on the entire planet, and then you have smaller stones on top, kind of either repairing the wall or adding to the wall, which was almost certainly done by the Inca, but there's a lot of debate as to who and when the bottom layer of masonry was constructed. And I think we might be looking at something similar here in Son Katlar, because, well, just look at how weathered the cyclopean blocks are. They look like they just look so old and so weathered. But you'll also notice stains from the soil that are on the rocks, and that's because this entire site, when archaeologists discovered it, this entire site was buried. So these rocks were weathered before they were buried by the soil. And you can see the soil marks on various stones as we walk around here. But I think there's a little bit of a mystery here, perhaps, because, you just have incredible cyclopean megalithic polygonal stonework. You have the blocks that are incredibly weathered. And then when you look at the smaller stones that make up the upper layer of masonry, those stones don't really seem to be weathered much at all. I want to take a moment just to talk about the Taliotic people and the taliots and the taula. So on Menorca, you have the Taliotic culture. And these are the mysterious group of people that arrived on the island somewhere between the 1st and 2nd millennium BC. Maybe 1800 BC is a relatively accepted date. And so you have the Taliotic culture arrives. Nobody really knows who they were, where they came from. I think it's pretty obvious they most likely came from Sardinia, but maybe it was more nuanced than that. There might have been multiple influences, multiple migrations to the island. And then you have the Taliots. And the Taliots are these watchtower-like structures that we looked at before that are almost identical to the Nuragies of Sardinia that were built by the Nuragic civilization. And then you have the Taulas. And the Taulas are the T-pillars. Taula, the word taula literally means table in Catalan, and they're called taula because they were considered to be a giant's table, a table that giants could eat at, which is interesting because you find a lot of mythology about giants around the islands. Yes, I do think that large hominid species probably existed. There's just too much talk of them in ancient lore and ancient texts and mythologies for that to be totally a myth. You find, smaller species of hominids like the hobbit they found on the island of Java. So yeah, I think probably large humans existed, but anyway, that's a bit of a rant. So we have the Taliots and the Taula that were built by the Taliotic culture, which basically nobody really knows who they were. And clearly there's a lot going on here in Menorca. When you find Cyclopean megalithic polygonal masonry, you find several phases of construction, incredible weathering. Then you find these identical temples to Gobekli Tepe and the calling card of the Nuragic civilization, which are the Taliots, which if you placed any Taliot in Sardinia, they would call it a Nuragi. So next video, we're going to be heading back to Sardinia to take a look in depth, but there's still a few more things here in Menorca that I want to show you. So back at Torralba den Solor, where we found the Taula with the spine that was anthropomorphized, there's a little placard giving some indication as to exactly how old this structure is and the methods that they use to determine its age. And as you can see, the West Taliot is located next to the Taula enclosure. It also has a circular floor plan. The dating of some cereals using carbon-14 has made it possible to determine its date, 12th century BC. The West Taliot was probably built on a Bronze Age dwelling. Only a section of the outer wall remains today, as it was probably demolished when the Taula enclosure was erected. The West Taliot was excavated by William Waldron and Manuel Fernandez Miranda in the 1970s. So there you have it, folks. They're basing the dating of this entire monument based on some cereals that they carbon-14 dated. And of course, the problem with this is that those cereals could have been deposited in the site after its construction, perhaps even much later. Is it really wise to be dating these sites based on a couple of cereals that you find in the site? I mean, let's say this site was 5,000 years old or 10,000 years old, and 2,000 years ago, a group of people discovers it or modifies it or settles it or starts utilizing it, and they leave some cereals. And then 2,000 years after that, some archaeologists come along, they find the cereals, they carbon-14 date them, they're 2,000 years old, and they say, okay, this site was constructed 2,000 years ago. I mean, it's such a flawed way of determining an age of a site. And I'm not saying it's not useful. It's incredibly useful, and it's a powerful tool. But to state matter-of-factly that a site was constructed at a certain time based on a few cereals that you found in carbon dated, I just think that is flawed. Interesting note here about this Taula real quick. You can see how it was covered up to its top in dirt. That stain of soil along the side was left there during the excavations. But you can see most of these T-pillars were literally just sticking out of the ground, and soil had accumulated around them. That's how long they've been here. And Yeah. Yeah, they just find them sticking out of the ground just like in Turkey, and they start excavating them. There's still taulas sticking out of the ground all over Menorca that haven't been excavated yet. There's tons of rock-cut tombs or Hippogya Caves on Menorca. This one, the entrance to the cave is sculpted, and it looks almost identical to the Hypogeum of House Laflani in Malta, where they sculpted the interior to appear as though it was in the style of megalithic architecture. It's really a unique thing, and I've only seen it in the Hypogeum of Malta and here at this rock-cut tomb of Menorca. The Taliotic people of Menorca appeared to be bull worshippers, as indicated by this bronze bull found at Torralba den Solor, seemingly to date to 3 to 4th century BCE. And this ceremonial bullhorn. You may remember that bull worship was also a part of life in Turkey and in Malta and in Sardinia. And who else do we find in the archaeological record of Menorca but Imhotep, found in the Taula enclosure of Torre den Galms? He was a physician, astronomer, and architect, and erected the first pyramid, that would be the Step Pyramid, in Egypt. And we also find Horus and cart ruts. What does it mean if the Taliotic culture of Menorca was influenced by Gobekli Tepe or was in some ways a legacy of Gobekli Tepe? And what are the implications of that? Because these are the only two places in the entire world that you find these T-pillar temples. And in both cases, Menorca and Gobekli Tepe, you enter the temples from the south facing north. You pray facing north. There is 1 or 2 dominant T-pillars in the center of the temple. The temple itself is a circular enclosure made of smaller stones with upright T-pillars erected, embedded in the walls. And I think the similarities here are just too many to attribute to coincidence. I think that Gobekli Tepe likely did influence the Taliotic culture of Menorca. I think some aspect of their tradition and their temple building culture was passed down. And that is a fascinating possibility because there were no T-pillar temples that were built anytime in between Gobekli Tepe and the Taliotic people of Menorca, which means that the practice was more or less discontinued, unless there's T-pillar temples that we haven't found, and that could very well be the case. But no one really built any T-pillar temples after those of Gobekli Tepe until they started building them in Menorca. And the big question in my mind is, what was the vehicle of transmission? How did this wisdom get transmitted from Gobekli Tepe to Menorca? And in that line of inquiry, we have to consider the possibility that the Taliotic people of Menorca possibly had access to imperishable records or a hall of records. I'm talking about the kind that is mentioned in Plato's Timaeus, when an Egyptian priest is speaking to Solon, kind of chiding him because the Greeks did not keep imperishable records, and the Egyptians did. And the Greeks only remembered one flood, but there had been many. And the Greeks didn't even remember a lost race of people that lived on their own land that were the finest men ever known. That's one mention. Another mention is Al-Masudi. We talked about that with Sagmatar. Al-Masudi's Sabian Hall of Records, which goes back to time immemorial. So there's numerous references to a hall of records or imperishable records that go back to the time of the gods or time immemorial. And maybe the Menorcans, the Taliots, the Taliotic people, maybe they had access to a hall of records. I mean, we do find this Imhotep figurine. Maybe they would go to Egypt. Maybe they were wise men and women of learning, and they were invited to to view the Hall of Records. I don't think that's such a crazy possibility. I mean, if a civilization went through all the trouble to create imperishable records and to create a Hall of Records, I'm sure they would have wanted to share that with the wise people of other lands and the elders of other places, especially when you consider the tale of the Sabian Hall of Records. You have to be their equal in science and mathematics and might to access their Hall of Records. So they seem to want to share their knowledge with people whom they considered to be equal. So getting back to all this, how did the knowledge, the symbolism, the models for temples, how did all that transmit from Gobekli Tepe to Menorca? Was there a Hall of Records that maybe contained the wisdom of these temples? Maybe it contained instructions on how to build cyclopean polygonal walls. Maybe a lot of the similarities that we see, maybe the knowledge of these things was contained in a Hall of Records, and that's why they pop up around the world, because the wise elders of various lands would travel to maybe places like Egypt or Turkey to enter the Hall of Records and to initiate into the mysteries contained there. And maybe they contain such things as T-pillar temples and cyclopean polygonal walls. All right, friends, well, I think that's enough for today. I'm just going to leave you with this photo of me standing in front of a Taula for size comparison, because these monuments are truly enormous and they just tower over you. And I hope everyone out there gets the chance to visit this magical land one day.